I still get chills every time I talk about it, but it's a story that needs to be told. It happened one cold night when I was living alone in a small rental house just outside the city. I had recently gone through a tough breakup, so I was spending a lot of time by myself, trying to adjust to the quiet and the solitude. That evening, I was curled up on the couch watching a movie when I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe it was a stray cat, or even the neighbor coming home late. But then I heard something that made my heart stop, a soft scraping at the back door. I paused the movie and listened. For a moment, everything was silent, and I thought maybe I was imagining things. Then the handle of the back door jiggled, slowly at first, then more urgently, as if someone was trying to force their way in. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone, but before I could call anyone, I heard a loud crack. The door had burst open. I jumped up from the couch and bolted toward my bedroom. As I ran, I glanced back and saw a man standing in the doorway. He was disheveled, his clothes dirty and torn, his face hidden beneath a hood. He looked wild, desperate. A homeless man, I assumed. But there was something more menacing in the way he stood there, his eyes scanning the room like a predator. I slammed the bedroom door shut, locked it, and pressed my back against it, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. The operator picked up, but before I could say much, I heard heavy footsteps coming down the hall, getting closer and closer. My heart was racing. "I'm in my house," I whispered into the phone. "Someone broke in. Please send help." As I spoke, the man started banging on the bedroom door. Hard. The wood rattled under the force. He wasn't yelling or saying anything, just pounding on the door like he was trying to break it down. I backed away, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on the closet, where I kept an old metal clothes rod. I grabbed it and held it in front of me, shaking, knowing it was the only thing I had between me and him. Then, just as suddenly as the banging had started, it stopped. I stood there, frozen, listening to the eerie silence that followed. The only sound was my own heavy breathing. I couldn't hear him anymore, but I knew he was still out there, hiding, waiting. The minutes dragged on like hours until finally, the sound of police sirens were heard. Moments later, I heard officers calling out from outside, telling me they were there. I rushed to the window and saw their flashing lights. Relief washed over me, but my body was still shaking. When the police came in, they found the back door wide open, but the man was gone. They searched the house and the surrounding area, but never found him. The officers told me he had probably been homeless, just looking for a place to stay. But I knew it was more than that. The way he banged on my door, the look in his eyes when he saw me, he wasn't just looking for shelter. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep without hearing that banging sound in my head. I moved out of that house as soon as I could, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still think about him. I wonder if he ever tried to break into someone else's home, and if they weren't as lucky as I was. My wife Sarah and I had settled into bed after a long day. The house was quiet, the only sounds being the distant hum of traffic and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. We had lived in our cozy two-story home for years and had never once felt unsafe. But that night, everything changed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a branch scraping against the window. But when I listened closer, it was clear. Someone was downstairs. I nudged Sarah awake, and her eyes went wide as soon as I told her what I heard. We stayed completely still, barely breathing, straining to catch any sound. There it was again, a faint shuffle, and then the unmistakable sound of a window sliding open. I remember the fear in Sarah's eyes. She whispered, "What do we do?" My heart was racing, but I knew we had to act fast. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed and told her to lock herself in the closet and call 911. She didn't want to leave me, but I insisted. Reluctantly, she slipped into the closet, her voice trembling as she dialed the police. I crept down the stairs, every step feeling like an eternity. My mind was racing with thoughts of what could happen. When I reached the living room, I saw a dark figure moving in the shadows, rifling through our things. He was wearing a hood, his back turned to me. I had no idea if he was armed, but I knew I had to protect Sarah. I took a deep breath and raised the bat, But before I could make a move, the intruder turned around. We locked eyes, and in that moment, both of us froze. He was just as startled as I was. For a split second, I thought he might run. But then he lunged toward me. Instinct took over. I swung the bat with everything I had. He dodged, but I managed to hit his arm, knocking something out of his hand. Later, I'd find out it was a knife. He stumbled back, and just as I was about to go after him again, I heard the sound of sirens approaching. The intruder must have heard them too, because without another word, he bolted out the door he'd come through, disappearing into the night. The police arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. They searched the area, but the intruder was long gone. Sarah came rushing downstairs as soon as the officers entered, and we held each other tightly, still shaking from the adrenaline and fear. In the days that followed, we installed a security system, reinforced the windows, and even got a dog. But more than that, the experience brought Sarah and me closer. That night was the scariest moment of my life, but knowing that we faced it together and came out safe strengthened our bond in a way nothing else could. We never found out who the intruder was, and we still have moments where we feel that lingering unease. But I know one thing for certain. That night, we survived, and as long as we have each other, we can face anything. It was a Saturday night, and my roommate Hannah and I were sitting in our apartment, drinking wine and talking about the usual. Work, weekend plans, and of course, Hannah's ex, Jake. He had been a part of our lives for way too long, even after they broke up. The relationship had been toxic from the start, full of jealousy and controlling behavior. She finally ended it a few months ago, but Jake wouldn't leave her alone. He'd show up at random times, text her nonstop, and sometimes even wait outside our apartment. That night, we were both trying to relax and forget about him. The apartment felt like a safe haven, and we didn't think he would be bold enough to come by again. But we were wrong. It was close to midnight when we heard a knock on the door. Hannah froze, her eyes wide. "It's him," she whispered. I went to the peephole, and sure enough, there was Jake, pacing in the hallway, looking agitated. "He'll leave if we ignore him," I said, trying to sound confident, but I could feel my stomach twisting. We turned off the lights and sat quietly, waiting for him to leave. The knocking grew louder, then stopped. We thought maybe he had given up, but then we heard a loud thud against the door. He was trying to force his way in. Hannah's face went pale. "We need to call the police," she said, her voice shaking. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation in hushed tones. The operator told us to stay inside and stay on the line, but as I spoke, there was a sudden crash. The door had burst open. Jake stormed in, his face twisted with rage. "Hannah, where are you?" he shouted. He looked wild, more unhinged than I had ever seen him. We were both hiding in my bedroom at that point, trying to barricade the door with furniture. I could hear him stomping through the apartment, throwing things around, searching for her. "Hannah, you can't hide from me forever." His voice was filled with fury, and it echoed down the hallway. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to the phone. The operator assured me the police were on their way, but I wasn't sure they'd make it in time. We heard Jake banging on my bedroom door next, trying to force it open. "I just want to talk," he yelled, but the pounding in his voice told a different story. The door was rattling with every hit. I thought it was only a matter of time before he broke through. Then suddenly everything went quiet. The banging stopped. For a moment, all we could hear was our own breathing. I leaned closer to the door, trying to listen. It was eerily silent, and I couldn't tell if he had left or was waiting outside, planning his next move. Just as I was about to peek through the crack in the door, we heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. The police. They shouted Jake's name, demanding he show himself. The sound of their voices felt like the first moment of relief we'd had all night. There was a scuffle, the sound of something crashing, then more shouting. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers knocked on our door. "It's safe now," he said. "You can come out." We opened the door slowly, and there was Jake, handcuffed and pinned against the wall by two officers. His face was flushed with anger, but he didn't say a word as they dragged him out of the apartment. Hannah collapsed onto the couch, shaking with relief and fear. We sat there for what felt like hours, unable to process what had just happened. The police explained that Jake had been arrested for breaking and entering, and they would make sure he couldn't come near us again. They also helped us repair the door, which was barely hanging on its hinges. That night changed everything for us. Even after the police assured us we were safe, we couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. We moved out of that apartment a month later, and Hannah got a restraining order. But the fear stayed with us. Every creak, every knock at the door, it all reminded us of that night. We survived, but just barely. And the scariest part? We never really saw it coming. Jake had been a problem for months, but we didn't think he'd ever go that far. Now, we know better.